Ever get this feeling, like a kind of deep down sense of something that goes beyond your own experiences? Like maybe a nervousness you can't quite place, or like you're drawn to something but you can't explain why.
Yeah, yeah.
Today on Dance Queen, we're going deep, like really deep into this wild idea. What if our parents' lives leave, I don't know, more than just memories and stories? Like what if they actually leave some sort of like biological imprint on us?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Welcome back to another deep dive.
I'm Lily.
And I'm Edward. So a listener, you, sent in a really fascinating collection of articles all about epigenetics and this whole idea of generational trauma.
Yeah, it's a hot topic.
And we're going to break down what the science actually says. Our mission today is to take these complex scientific ideas and make them clear and engaging, easy to understand. So you can really get the core concepts and, figure out what this all means for how we think about ourselves and our families.
For sure. You sent us some great stuff, including insights from this book, DNA, What Epigenetics Teaches Us About Ourselves.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It brings together a lot of the research in this area, so we'll be looking at findings from studies on animals, research on people who have survived trauma, and even discussions around how these epigenetic changes might be passed down through generations.
Okay, so the big question we're tackling today is, do we inherit specific memories through our DNA?
Right.
Like, is it encoded in there? And if not, what do we potentially inherit from our parents' experiences, especially those significant life events they went through?
Okay, so Edward, let's just get right to it. Based on what scientists understand right now, it seems like specific memories, like the detailed memory of a specific event, aren't directly passed down in our genetic code.
Okay.
But that's not the whole picture.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
This is where epigenetics comes in, and it's super interesting. Think of epigenetics like a set of instructions that sit on top of our DNA.
Yeah, like notes.
Right, like notes.
Yeah.
These instructions don't actually change the underlying DNA sequence, but they control which genes are turned on or off.
Like a switch.
Exactly, like a switch. And here's the wild part. These instructions can be influenced by a parent's environment and experiences, especially those that are, really intense or traumatic.
Yeah, think about those studies with mice and the smell of acetophenone.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
This was published in Nature Neuroscience, and what they did was they trained male mice to associate this particular smell with mild electric shocks.
Ouch!
Right. So basically, they're creating a fear response in these mice, and what the researchers saw in the offspring of those mice was pretty amazing. Even though the offspring had never encountered acetophenone and they'd never experienced the shocks themselves, they still showed a heightened fear reaction to that specific smell.
Whoa, so even without that direct experience, they were predisposed to be afraid of it.
It seems that way. This first generation, the F1 generation, they showed what's called an enhanced odor-potentiated startle response. So they'd react much more strongly to a sudden noise when that acetophenone smell was present. And there's more. They found physical changes in the brains of these mice, too.
Like what?
The olfactory bulb glomeruli, these are the parts of the brain responsible for detecting smells. They were larger in areas related to acetophenone.
So, their brains were physically different because their dads had this experience.
That's what it looks like. And they even uncovered a potential biological mechanism for this.
Okay, what is it?
The sperm DNA of those male mice that had been conditioned to fear the smell, it showed a change called hypomethylation.
Hypo what?
Hypomethylation. Basically, it's a change at a specific gene called ULFR151. And this suggests a direct epigenetic link, like a change in the DNA that wasn't in the genetic code itself, but in how that gene was marked, if you will.
Okay, I think I'm following. So it's like a tag on the DNA.
Yeah.
And this tag is saying, hey, pay attention to this gene, make it more active.
You got it.
And this all stems from the dad's experience.
Exactly.
And it gets even crazier. This wasn't just limited to the first generation. It even affected the F2 generation, the grandchildren of the original mice.
I know, right? It makes you wonder, what if some of our anxieties or fears, maybe those that seem to run in families, could have some kind of epigenetic basis? It's not that we inherit a specific memory of the event, but maybe a biological preparedness to be more sensitive to certain triggers.
That's like a whole new way of looking at family history.
Yeah.
So we've got these intriguing findings from animal studies. What about research on humans? What are we seeing when we look at the impact of trauma across generations in people?
Well, As you might imagine, it's a lot more complex in humans, but there are some really interesting findings. For example, there have been studies on Holocaust survivors and their children.
Right, a very specific and, horrific type of trauma.
Exactly. And these studies have shown that the offspring of Holocaust survivors often have altered methylation patterns, especially in genes related to stress response. One gene that comes up a lot is FKBP5.
So this suggests that there might be a biological link between a parent's trauma, like experiencing the Holocaust, and an increased vulnerability to stress-related disorders in their children.
That's one interpretation, yeah. And there's another example that highlights this potential link between parental experience and offspring health. The Dutch hunger winter.
Right, during World War II.
Yeah. So babies born to mothers who went through famine during pregnancy, they showed epigenetic changes that seem to increase their risk of metabolic disorders later in life.
Wow, so these experiences, they're not just affecting the parent, but potentially their children too, even decades later.
It really is remarkable.
Now, it's super important for our listeners to understand, and our sources really emphasize this, that these human studies don't prove that we inherit specific memories.
Right. It's not like downloading a file from your parent's brain.
Exactly. What they suggest is an increased predisposition to certain conditions or altered ways of responding to stress.
It's like maybe you inherit a slight tendency towards anxiety, not the memory of a specific anxious event that your parent went through.
Right. And it's also worth pointing out that there's still a lot of scientific debate about how much of this is directly caused by these epigenetic marks and how much other factors play a role.
Yeah, things like shared environment, how families cope with trauma, even cultural influences, all those things can contribute too.
It's complicated, and scientists are still figuring it all out.
Mm.
Okay, so we've talked about these epigenetic changes, but how do they actually get passed down from parent to child?
Well, our sources highlight a few key mechanisms. First, there's DNA methylation.
Right, we touched on that earlier.
Basically, it involves adding these little chemical tags called methyl groups to the DNA, which can often silence a gene or make it less active.
And trauma can mess with these methylation patterns, right?
Exactly. It can lead to changes in methylation at very specific spots in our DNA. Then there's histone modification.
Okay, remind me what histones are again.
So imagine our DNA, which is the super long molecule, right? It's all wound up around proteins called histones. Like, if you think of DNA as thread, the histones are like spools.
Okay, I get the visual.
These histones help to organize and package all that DNA, and changes to these histones, like adding or removing chemical tags, can affect how tightly the DNA is wound.
And that changes how genes are accessed.
Exactly. It controls whether the cellular machinery can easily get to those genes and express them. And get this, some of these histone modifications can be passed down across generations too.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild to think that our experiences could literally change the way our DNA is packaged, and that could potentially be inherited by our children.
That is mind-blowing. So it's not just the DNA sequence itself, it's how it's structured and organized.
Right. And then there's another mechanism, non-coding RNA.
Now, what are those again?
These are RNA molecules that don't actually code for proteins like the RNA we usually hear about. They have more of a regulatory role influencing how genes are expressed.
Okay.
Our sources suggest that these non-coding RNAs might also play a role in this whole transgenerational inheritance thing, but scientists are still figuring out exactly how they impact traits related to memory and behavior.
So to be crystal clear for our listeners,
Yeah.
based on what we know now, your child won't suddenly have a flashback to a traumatic event that happened to you.
Right, they're not going to inherit your specific memories.
What seems to be passed down are these more subtle biological changes, these epigenetic marks, that might make them more sensitive to certain types of stress or increase their risk for certain conditions.
It's more about a shift in their biological predisposition, not like inheriting your lived experiences as memories.
Right. And it's important to remember that it's not just trauma that can lead to these changes.
Yeah.
Our sources also talk about how other things, like what our parents ate, or if they were exposed to toxins, can also cause epigenetic changes that can affect their offspring.
Yeah, it's like those experiences might influence things like their children's metabolism or even their general tendencies in terms of behavior. Again, it's not specific memories of what the parent ate or was exposed to, but broader biological shifts that can have lasting effects.
And you know what's really fascinating? These epigenetic changes aren't necessarily permanent. Yeah, our sources emphasize that the environment and experiences of the offspring themselves can potentially influence or even reverse some of these inherited predispositions.
So it's not like a set destiny.
Not at all. It highlights this really dynamic interplay between our genes, these epigenetic markers, and the lives we live. Our experiences can shape how our genes are expressed, and that could even influence the next generation. But it's not a fixed fate.
That's really hopeful, actually.
It is. And this whole field of epigenetics, it has huge implications for how we think about mental health, especially conditions like PTSD and anxiety. It raises the possibility that in the future, we might be able to develop therapies that specifically target these epigenetic marks.
That would be incredible.
It would. But, as our sources point out, that kind of research is still in the very early stages. There's still a lot we don't know about these transgenerational effects and how they work in humans.
It's a really exciting area of research, though.
Definitely. So for you, the listener, what does this all mean? Basically, while you won't inherit specific memories from your parents, their life experiences, especially those that were really intense or traumatic, could have subtly shaped your biology.
Yeah, maybe in ways you haven't even considered before.
Right. It might be influencing your sensitivities, your predispositions, maybe even some of those vague feelings or tendencies you've always had but couldn't quite explain. Just think about those moments when you feel anxious or stressed, and you can't quite put your finger on why. Could it be that these subtle biological inheritances are playing a role, not as a direct memory of your ancestors' trauma, but as a heightened sensitivity to stress that's been passed down through generations?
It's such a fascinating idea to consider.
So to sum it all up, while science doesn't back up the idea that we inherit specific, detailed memories through our DNA, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that significant parental experiences, especially those involving trauma, can lead to epigenetic changes that can be inherited.
It's not about inheriting specific memories, but about inheriting a kind of biological predisposition that might make us more or less susceptible to certain things.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, if our parents' experiences can leave these subtle marks on us, how might our own life experiences shape the biology of future generations? What kind of responsibility does that understanding give us for our own well-being and the environment we create for our children and grandchildren?
That's a big question to ponder.
It really is. Well, this has been a truly mind-bending deep dive into the world of epigenetics and generational inheritance.
Absolutely fascinating.
And if you want to explore more of these deep dives, check out related articles, or see what resources we recommend, be sure to visit us at www.dansplain.xyz. Thanks for joining us for this exploration.
Thanks for listening.